Hello and welcome to Tableau Server Monitoring. I hope you've all been having a good conference, got to attend the keynotes and stuff. Um, I'm a senior manager of product management working on our server platform as such. So everything on the server foundation and the administration experience of the server, I'm one of the product managers in that team. And with me is Daniel Ram.
Hi, my name is Dan. I'm a supportability engagement engineer on our release and feedback team. My primary goal is to actually work with customer defects and work them through to sustaining in the development teams so that we can go through and can implement fixes.
Cool. Before we get too far, I do want to call out this session is repeated tomorrow. And so if for whatever reason you have a conflict, you can again come back tomorrow.
I think the session are videotape, right?
Yes.
So when we can check out the video?
The videos are typically available a week after the conference. So you'll get some kind of notification. So let's run through the agenda real quick. We've already talked about the introductions. We'll just start with the basic of why even monitor your Tableau server. You obviously have it up and running. Like, why should you bother even monitoring or doing anything with your Tableau server? And then we'll talk about the different ways that you can monitor Tableau server. There's multiple ways you can approach it, and each of them has its pluses and minuses. We'll kind of talk about them at a high level, and then we'll talk about kind of the top two ones, which are admin views and Tableau server logs, before getting into the meat of it with Tabmon. And then we'll talk about how Tabmon and the things that you learned today can be used to leverage other monitoring tools that may be standard within your IT environment. Right? And then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to just come up and talk at the end. We'll hope to have a good conversation. So why monitor Tableau server? More than anything else, you have deployed Tableau server to get full value out of your Tableau investment. And you want to make sure that your users, or the business users and everybody, have a good experience with Tableau server, right? And you want to make sure that it's actually meeting their needs, and you don't want something in the way Tableau server is configured or set up or anything else come in between your business and them kind of achieving their business goals. So that's really why you want to monitor Tableau server. It also helps you as IT, for the most part, to plan for the future, right? You want to be able to not just deploy Tableau server, but grow it to meet the needs of your organization, not just today, but also tomorrow. And to be able to do that, you need to have a pretty good understanding of how your Tableau server is doing today and kind of what's going well and what needs tweaks and things like that. So let's delve right in. At the high level, there are three buckets that we think of for monitoring Tableau server. The first one and the most kind of simplest one is the admin views. So admin views are a set of built-in wizards that are included with Tableau server, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they're there to answer some high-level questions about usage of your Tableau server. The next bucket is Tableau server logs. There are many different logs from many different processes on Tableau server logs that logs are written out for, and you can actually mine a wealth of information from them if you so choose. And so that will give you a pretty intricate knowledge about the inner workings of server and how things are going. But the flip side of that is you do need to have some level of knowledge about the architecture of Tableau server itself, like what the various processes do, what their role they serve in the overall architecture and things like that. And then third, we have Tabmon, which is now actually published as an open source tool for collecting performance counters that's written by Tableau. There is some configuration and setup required, but Tabmon knows which performance counters are relevant to Tableau server, and it will produce some pretty good reports out of that. And so we'll look at that again in more detail. I'm going to talk about admin views real quick and kind of give you a couple of examples about kind of where it can be useful. Like I said, it's a series of wizards that's included with Tableau server that's built off the Postgres repository. So in case you didn't know, we have a Postgres repository in server where all our information is stored. And that includes information about even historical usage in terms of what views were loaded and things like that. And so the wizards are essentially a set of views that tell you information about the usage of Tableau server built on Postgres. There are server-level views and site-level views as well. Now, you can go pretty advanced and actually connect Postgres directly and build some custom admin views if you so choose. But that's a more advanced topic, and that requires some knowledge about the Postgres schema and things like that. We're not going to go there today. But there are other talks that cover that. To get to the admin views, it's a little not very intuitive sometimes. If you click on the status, you'll then have to choose. If you're actually a server administrator, you'll see the options to see all sites or an individual site. So if you're a server administrator, you can look at both the server level views as well as site level views. If you're a site level administrator, then you can only see a site level view. So that's a little bit of point of confusion I've seen with customers sometimes in terms of how they access the two different levels of views. I'm going to jump right into a use case here. And these are kind of the various ways that you can use an admin view for. But I'm going to jump right into the use case here. One of the admin views here is traffic to views. This shows you a wealth of information in terms of what kind of views are accessed on your server. There's actually chairs in the middle here if you want to come in. So what kind of views are accessed on your server, what projects they actually belong to. And so we actually made some updates for this with V10, where we added a project level view. And so you can look at what projects are the most popular, how those view counts are trending over time. And within a particular project, you can actually see which views are accessed the most and which users are accessing the views the most. So this gives you a pretty holistic information about what views are most popular on your server, what users are actually using your system the most, if you want to reach out to them, for example, right? Now, you want to make sure that your most popular views are performing well, right? There's another view that actually tells you the performance and the actual load times of various views. So if you actually go, and there's actually a filter at the top that I've filtered down to the most popular view here, it will actually show you not just in the last kind of 1 hour or 2 hours in terms of what the view times, what the load times have been, but also kind of individual actual entries in terms of how long it took. So you can see that for the most part, everything has been sub-second for this view, and so I feel pretty good about it. Now, you could see that your most popular view is actually taking a long time to load, right? Or there are some outliers where some users are taking a very long time. This serves as a starting point for you to kind of start your investigation, right? I would strongly recommend that everybody be looking at kind of your most popular views, how long things are taking, just to get a sense for your user perception of your server installation, right? Because there are any number of factors that can come in around the performance of a view, including a badly authored workbook sometimes. And so you want to make sure that your server is performing well and meeting the needs of your users. The second view I want to talk about, again, this is another new one that we added for version 10, is around background task delays. This is another complaint that we've heard from customers, is like that oftentimes their extract refreshes are delayed, subscriptions are delayed, and they don't have a good sense for understanding their background or capacity, right? Customers frequently ask us, how do I know I'm hitting my capacity of my server? And so this view added in V10 helps you get a sense of capacity on your server. So this gives you the delta between when a job was scheduled to run versus when it actually started running, right? And so you see that almost every day at 4 a.m., you have a spike in wait times, literally 100, 150 minutes at times. That indicates that a number of jobs have been scheduled at 4 a.m., such that your background or capacity is getting exhausted. And so you need to kind of add background. You can do one of two things. You can schedule your extracts to run in a more staggered fashion, so kind of change some of your extracts to not run at 4 a.m. and maybe a different time. Or you could add additional background or capacity. So I don't know if you got a chance to attend the IT keynote before this. But one of the things that they kind of showed off there was the ability to dynamically change the number of backgrounders on your server without requiring a restart. So that functionality will be coming soon, sometime next year. And that will enable you to even automatically detect situations like this and where there's a bottleneck and possibly automatically increase or decrease the number of backgrounders, right? So this is another one that gives you out of the box, without any work required, just a very good view of capacity of your server. To talk more about Tableau server logs, now I'll switch it over to Dan.
Thanks, Ramesh. So, as Ramesh mentioned, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to talk about Tableau server logs. What are they? How do we apply them? I'm going to start at the 10,000-foot view of really what is a log file, what it's built for, down to what we see in Tableau server and how we actually apply these to our server monitoring. So let's begin. So the first question I have, and I think most people have, is what are Tableau server logs? So Tableau server logs are a series of files that Tableau server writes out to in order to record events that occur within Tableau server. So they're generally formatted in one of two fashions. They're either a text delimited file, so this is something that log4j, for instance, will write out to, or all of our C++ logs will log out to the JSON file type. Now that we kind of know what Tableau server logs are, let's talk a little bit about where we can find the Tableau server logs so that we can go through and do some real-time investigation on it. In order to find the Tableau server logs, we start off at root. After root, we go Tableau, Tableau server, data, tab svc, and logs. Within this directory, we can actually go and find a folder for every single process that Tableau server has. And this allows us to go through and dig in and actually look into the log files that we have open for this. The C++ logs, on the other hand, are a little less intuitive. Now, those can also be found at the root Tableau, Tableau server, data, tab svc, vizql server, and logs. Now, the reason I say this is unintuitive is because putting everything in the vizql server folder seems that only vizql server would be implementing C++. Well, in reality, this is kind of an old bit of architecture. So most of our code that uses C++ actually uses the same set of DLLs, which means that they all go through and they all log to the exact same place. But if we're going to go through and if we're going to look into logs, honestly, I think the easiest way for us to actually do that is to go through and either use tabadmin zip logs or the Tableau server UI. We're able to take snapshots that way. I went through and I put some links up there. That way, one, this is released. You guys can go and look at it. That way, you don't have to search through our website, and then it'll give you some better options as to actually collecting the logs. So moving forward, I want to step into JSON a little bit because I mentioned one of the major file types we use for C++ is actually a JSON format. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. What it really is, it's a lightweight framework that allows us to go through and using key value pairs, add metadata and structure to logs that would normally just be lines of text and they'd be human readable. What this does for us is it makes it really easy to go and collect and understand the metadata, while also understanding and being able to parse this with machines. So it just really adds some usability and ease of use to it. Now that we kind of understand what JSON is, my next question is why JSON? Why do we implement this? And to be honest, it's so that we can retain metadata and we can retain a rigid structure for our logs. So I chose to put an example log set down there. And so you can actually see in the orange, that is all of the metadata. So within there, we have our timestamp, our process ID, our thread ID, all the way down to the session IDs. And so we're able to go through and we're able to see that on every single C++ log line, we have the same consistent metadata. Now, to further this along, we actually also put a key and a value there. So we're able to see what the key to this log is. So what is this log line doing? In this case, we're actually just denoting what the previous log was. And you can see that the value there was just the path that it used to be. So we're saying, hey, we're switching over logs now. This is where you want to find your old information if you look there. So that's really why we switched to JSON, and that's what JSON is. Moving forward, I just kind of want to step into what every single log or what the major logs tell us for Tableau server. That way we have a better idea of how to troubleshoot and how to look into this. So to start things off, let's just talk about Apache. So Apache is third-party open source, and we go through and we actually, it just records all the requests that we send to Tableau server that we use to communicate within Tableau server. The thing that we do a little bit different though is we actually put a request ID at the end of every request. That allows us to go through and track requests down within other log types. So say we have a bootstrap session and we're loading a view, we're able to go through and use that request ID to track into vizql server and take a look at what's going on, where is this view, and what lines correspond to this view. So it's a little bit different, makes things really easy. The next is our tab admin logs. Tab admin logs are really any administrator command at all. So anytime you do tab admin set and install and initialization, it all is really just what's going on at the top level, what we're all here to do, and what we're all setting up within Tableau server. Moving on, we have the tab service logs or tab svc. This is just our services. So this tells you whether it's up or down, whether things are failing, whether it's crashing. So this is very high level about our services. Moving on, we have Postgres. Postgres, just really any long-running queries. We default to about a second, so any query that takes longer than a second will be logged out there. But we also go through and we do some, we log out the Postgres events. So if it's starting or stopping, or if it's having errors, we'll also see it there. The last three, I honestly think, are probably the most important. We have VizQL Server, VizPortal, and Backgrounder. Those three are really there to show us what's going on when we're, one, loading views, two, working with Tableau Server and authenticating and that kind of thing, and three, going and doing any sort of backgrounder tasks, going and refreshing extracts, going through and reaping schedules, anything like that, we'll see it there. So now that we know what the logs are, what we should see into them, what do the Tableau Server logs tell us? Well, everything, almost. So the reason I say almost is because the way we view logs is that it's a very high level of what's going on. We're never going to go through and show what's happening within every class and every method that we go through and we use within Tableau Server. If we did that, it would be unreadable, the bloat would be huge. I mean, I don't even think we'd be able to really store out all the logs if we went through and we logged every single line that we ever did. So by going through and using the logs, though, we can easily start to read in and we can learn to see at a high level what Tableau Server is doing. You know, what's happening when someone goes through and authenticates? What happens when this view loads? How long do connections take? We're able to go through and really read. And so another reason I say almost actually has to do with the logging levels. I'm not sure how many of you are know about the logging levels, but I just kind of want to step into them a little bit because this is a big part about understanding logs and what you're seeing and what you're reading. So the main logging levels are fatal, error, warn, info, debug, and trace. And so they all go from the most sparse to the most dense logging. Fatals, errors, and warnings tend to be any sort of errors or crashes or anything that's really not okay for Tableau Server. Now, for errors and warnings, this doesn't necessarily mean that Tableau Server is going down, things are breaking or crashing, but it means we hit a bump in the road and we totally could have recovered, we totally could have not have recovered. But just because you see error doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. The info level, on the other hand, that is the most basic level of logging. That's what we are set at standard. That's just the high level, hey, you know, Tableau Server is authenticating here. We're using this class to do this. We're loading this workbook. And so that's basically what's going on at the high level. Now, the thing about that is it's all encompassing too. So while you'll get info level, you'll still get the warn, the errors, and the fatals. Now, if we want to go and step up verbosity a little bit, we can actually go through and look at the debug or the trace logs. Debug is, well, like it says, it's used for debugging. It just gives us a little bit more insight into what's happening. And trace is absolutely the most verbose. I don't really recommend trace because, like I said, if we go through and log out every single line that we have, it becomes too big, it becomes too unmanageable, and sometimes just reading it is impossible. That's really what it comes down to. So we now kind of understand what the log levels are. The only question I could think of afterwards is how do we set these, how do we change these? So this is yet again a tab admin set, and we're just going to go through and denote the process and the log level we want. So I put an example there as well as the link, just in case you guys want to go and take a look at how this works and how you'd go and change these. Cool. So, for the most part, right now it does, yes. But like I said, I really do recommend it sitting at info level because anything else that you get to can get really verbose, and what can be really big logs can become extremely massive logs. And so unless you're cleaning up all the time, it can almost do some harm to your environment more than anything else. So, all right.
So overall, we are making changes to reduce the number of restarts required. And so with some of the work we are doing now, sometime next year, we should have the ability to make some changes without requiring a restart. The log level will be one of those.
Cool. Thanks, Ramesh. So the next major subject that I want to talk about is Tabmon. So let's just dive into there. So what is Tabmon? Tabmon is an open source project that we started in Tableau. Its main job is to go through and pull counters. So that's pulling our JMX and Windows Server performance counters. We then actually write those counters out to a database or a CSV file, where we're then able to go through and consume and look at that data via Tableau Desktop. So the whole point of it is just to go and scrape the performance of your servers, put it in a Tableau Desktop, so that way you guys can go through, ask your questions, take a look at it, drag and drop, and do everything we're here to do, just explore your data. So after that, it's where do we get Tabmon? How do we get involved in Tabmon? Like I said, Tableau's open source. It lives on GitHub right now. If you have questions, ideas, if you guys want to pull the code, branch it off, and start building with it yourself, you see bugs in it, feel free to let us know. Feel free to pull it down yourself and work with it. I mean, we're always happy to have contributors, and it's always nice to see that someone's as into it as we are. So I kind of explained the high level of what Tabmon is, so I'm going to step down a little bit further into it. So what does Tabmon really do? So Tabmon is set up to go through and periodically pull our JMX counters and the Tableau server host counters. We do this by going through and leveraging the JMX counters exposed by our JVM and Tableau server, and we leverage a Microsoft library to actually go through and pull the host performance monitors and counters. Once we have all of that, we actually go through and we use an ORM to write out to Postgres and a CSV writer just to write out CSV. We tend to view the two as historical monitoring versus very short, I want to repro my issue type of monitoring. And so that's kind of why we have those two options there. Once we do that, we really pull the results into a workbook. We do offer a standard workbook that we can all go and take a look at. But what we want to really emphasize is that the importance of Tabmon isn't the workbook that we give you guys. It's the data source that lives behind it. So when you have your questions, you can go through and you can take a look at that. The nice thing about all this is that the results can go through and they can be applied to troubleshooting, scaling, whatever you have. Any questions that you have about how your server is doing, this can generally answer it without knowing, too much about what's going on within server. So now that we kind of know what Tabmon is, let's talk about how we apply it. So I really view it as two tools. I view it as a troubleshooting tool as well as a scaling and a performance monitoring, a historical performance monitoring tool. Now the way I go through and I actually apply it to my troubleshooting is the first thing is I set it up so I can either repro the issue or I can let an issue sit there until it occurs again. By doing that, we're able to go through and get a snapshot of how our performance is before, during, and afterwards. The nice thing about this is we can, one, use this data to validate an issue. Say we're getting performance issues, we can totally go through and validate, are we actually using as much memory as we think? Is everything slow because this server's overwhelmed? Or maybe something else is going on. Maybe a connection is slow. But it allows us to validate what's going on. It also allows us to understand how we were performing the whole time. And that's a big key to understanding defects and what's going on within Tableau Server. Knowing what we expect it to do versus what's actually happening can be the key difference to a defect versus just normal behavior and what can be a rough time or a very heavy time. And the last thing is we can actually compare these logs to Tableau Server logs. So if you go through and you actually parse Tableau Server logs, I talked about their JSON format. If you actually pull it in and you read them in as a data source, you can go through and you can blend with this and you can actually take a look, what are my resources versus the activity in my server logs? And from there, you're able to go through and see, oh, I see when I load this workbook, I get a spike in CPU over here. And so you're able to go through and start to answer those questions by using Tableau to explore your data. The second thing that I really like to use Tabmon for is actually just historical performance monitoring. It's really hard sometimes to go through and quantify what's going on within a server environment unless we have a good idea as to what's going on, what the resource usage was, before now and what's going on now. So maybe you go through and you upgrade Tableau Server, knowing how Tableau Server responded before the upgrade and after the upgrade is huge. You can definitely go through and you can record doing that. The other thing that it's really nice for, it's nice for going through and evaluating scale for server. A lot of times we'll think that, maybe we're too big of an environment, maybe we're too small of an environment. But going through and looking at the average resource usage throughout history can tell us a lot about, is our environment scaled correctly? The next two things that I really like to do with it is adjust my scheduled tasks and actually schedule downtime. And the way I do this is I go through and I look for lulls and spikes within the actual resource usage. If you see every day at 4 a.m. you're getting spikes, maybe we should go through and massage our schedules a little bit and change those around so we're not getting the same spikes and we're not getting the same load on our server. At the same time, say we need to go and schedule downtime. Well, if we had historical data, we can go and look and say, when's the quietest time historically for our server systems? And maybe it's like a Tuesday night. And if you know that, so next time you need to bring the Tableau server down, you can do it on a Tuesday. So knowing how it works now and historically is huge for really understanding your servers. Before I go on, I'd just like to do a quick demo, just kind of show how Tableau works. It's a really quick install process, so let me just jump there real quick. Sorry about this, I have to re-authenticate. So the actual Tableau installer was built using Wix, so that's Windows Installer XML framework. And it's a fairly simple installer. We'll just go and hit run. Within here, it shows that the actual base installer installs Postgres with it. That's because, like I said, we really do view this as a historical performance monitoring tool as opposed to a purely troubleshooting tool. But if that's not something that you guys really want, or you have your own Postgres installations, you can always deselect that. That's perfectly fine. The other bit I really want to show is just the options. So within it, we actually do have the option to initialize Postgres with the port, the username you want for your Tableau user, the password you want. We can also go through and denote the actual file that we're going to go through and install to, as well as the location that we're going to put Postgres. So that's basically the rundown of the installer. Yes, of course.
So the Postgres, the database install is different than the Tableau server?
Yes, and so the reason we did this, I really don't recommend ever going through and putting data within the Tableau Postgres. If you set the pull counter really low on this, so you're pulling it every second, you can go through and make gigs of data a day if you really want to. I really don't recommend doing that with the Tableau server environment because that means you're just adding bloat to the database. It's harder to work with it. It's heavier. You might be in line for queries. You might be struggling to get CPU time. So yeah, highly recommend going through and setting up your own if you're going to do historical monitoring. No. The other nice thing about this is this can actually run remotely. So as long as you have the same user command and the same permissions throughout users, you can go through and you can set this up. And you can actually, in the config, define the hosts that you're connecting to and the counters that you want to connect to on those hosts. And that allows you to go through and remotely pull. You can also set up different clusters. So you could potentially go through and monitor your dev cluster versus your QA cluster versus your prod cluster, and you can go through and you can actually compare those all at once. So that is basics of Tableau. I'm not actually going to do the install. The install is fairly quick, but with Postgres there, it adds some extra time to it. So let's just jump back into the actual presentation. So we are hoping to put it on Linux at some point. Sorry, it does not like when I'm jumping from here. So our game plan is to, at some point, put it on Linux, but the issue with Linux right now is .NET is still fairly tethered to Microsoft. I believe it's a .NET 5 that they're going to go and make it agnostic, kind of like Java, and run it in what's kind of like a JVM. So hopefully by then it should be able to run and we should be good to go. But now that we kind of understand what Tableau is and how to install it, where to find it, whatnot, let's go through. Let's look at two examples. I'm just going to run through the two examples before we jump in. That way this will be a little bit easier for us. So the first example I have is Tableau server performance is slow. Most of us heard this before as admins. Things get slow sometimes. Don't really know why. So the actual issue itself is on the 24th between 12 p.m. and 1:15 p.m. Users reported poor performance while loading workbooks. So something was slow. We need to see the resources to see if something's actually broken or if we just have a heavy user count. The important views that we're actually going to look at for here, or the important counters, are going to be the CPU utilization, our memory utilization, our cache hits and misses, our concurrent user sessions, and if we want to, we can also go and look into the number of bootstraps. I recommend doing that, though, via the logs as opposed to this. And our next example will actually be, is Tableau server scaled correctly? I talked about this earlier. Going through and collecting historical data can tell us a lot about our environments and whether or not we actually have them properly scaled for the usage that we see. So the actual topology of the server that we're going to go and look at has 6 cores, 16 gigs on the primary, and the 2 workers are 12 cores with 32 gigs of RAM. And so really what we're going to look through there is we're going to look for spikes, we're going to look for usage, how many users have hit this, how many workbooks are loaded, and we should be able to go through and get a good idea as to whether or not we're scaled the way we think we should be scaled. So with that, let's go through and let's jump into our first example. All right, so our first example is that users said that things were slow one day. Performance was tanking. They weren't quite sure during Bootstrap. So what is actually going on? So if we go through and we take a look at just the general what's going on page, we can already see that we have some major spikes. CPU usage is rather high, and it continues to climb throughout the day. While we do get one lull right here, for the most part, we can see that there's a lot of usage right there, and everything is pretty heavy, and everything is going to actually slow us down. The other bit that we can see is we can actually go and look at the processor queue length. The one thing I'd like to note about processor queue length is a healthy processor queue length is generally 1 to 2 threads in the queue per process. But based on what we see here, we probably have 4 or 5 major processes working right now. And in our spikes, we're seeing 20 threads in. So in my opinion, I don't think that's very healthy. I don't think that's something that we should really be settled with. I think that that's not necessarily good. So moving on, let's go and dig a little bit deeper into the actual CPU utilization, because that's really what this comes down to. We can see the spikes, and so let's move on. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I started there. I meant what's going on is actually tethered to Tableau server, and so it doesn't actually show us anything unless it's tethered. So the next bit is actually, let's go and look at the utilization by service. So we know that CPU is spiking. So our next question is, what service is actually causing this? What process is causing this? Because understanding the process means we can go and look at the logs, and we can go and investigate the exact cause of this. And so as we can see, the brown is taking up almost all of the CPU usage, and that's actually the VisQL server. So from my opinion, my view would be that this is likely an issue with load. We're probably loading too many workbooks at one point, something's being hit too hard, and it's making our resource usage spike and spike and spike. And we can actually go and see just the utilization by service down here as well. You can see that the VisQL server is far ahead of everything else. Now that we have a good idea about the CPU usage, let's just go and jump into memory. Just take a quick glance there, see if that's an issue. Looking at this, honestly, I don't think it's an issue. We can go see that we have loads and loads of free memory there. I don't think we would really have to look into this, or this would be a reason for it too. And so let's actually skip ahead. We'll go through and we'll take a look at the cache hits and miss analysis. So one thing I want to point out about the JMX counters, what they do is they actually calculate deltas. So that means they'll go through and look for the number of cache hits and cache misses and the difference between the last poll. So we can see a negative on the actual cache hit versus cache miss rate. And all that's saying is that if this was 50 and this is now 110, there's going to be 50 and negative 100. There is 150 less cache hits within that polling cycle. So that's really why we see that. It's all just a delta. So, we can right here see that we are going through and we are actually hitting the query cache pretty well. We get a dip in it, but overall there's a rise, which is a good thing. That's what we want to see. That's part of the reason we're probably not using that's one of the reasons that we're probably using less CPU than we are, but it's still good to note that we have that there. Now, the last thing I want to look at is the actual concurrent users. And this is the one that I really wanted to point out because this one's odd. And this really shows kind of what's going on and why things are failing. If you go through and you look at the number of users that logged in per hour, we get 0. So it seems a little bit odd that people go through and report that something's going on when nothing logged in. Well, the issue is everyone was logging in as a guest. Nobody was actually going through authenticating. We were all going through viewing it as a guest. And we can see that we still had active sessions, but everyone was working as a guest. So from my opinion and what I know about this, I would say at this point that it's likely that we had way too many views loaded. I would go through and look at the logs after this and compare it. But in the end, what actually happened was I was performing a load test. And so anyone who was using my box was actually running into a load test that I was running. I was running, I think, like 40 concurrent threads against this thing. So it was a pretty heavy load test at that point. So that's just one way I would go through and use Tabmon and just the basic workbook to look into actual performance metrics. Our next example is actually just, yes, of course.
CPU utilization by service, right? So if you have multiple services, you can have multiple VisQL services running.
Yeah.
Right? How does that work? Does it show you? Because I think so one. In this case, you only have one. Running.
Yeah. So
if you had multiple, it would show you.
So the box that I had that on isn't a very powerful box. So I actually dropped all my processes down to 1. And by dropping it down to 1, that means I could actually go through and hit it with more threads before it would fall over. And so the point was to get the CPU as high as I could without making it fall over, so we'd have a larger data set to look at. So that's why. Normally, see that how we have the split in colors right there? That's basically what we would look at. So now that we have that example, let's go through and let's actually take a look at the scaling example. So is my Tableau server scaled correctly? And the first thing we're going to look at yet again is the CPU usage. Take a quick look and understand what's going on. And so what we can see is that the average CPU usage is below 10% on all nodes. That's really low. I took this probably over almost a week, and we never really saw the CPU usage spike below or spike above 10%. The other bit too is actually our queue length never hit above one per minute. That's also extremely low. That's almost unimaginably low. So that is kind of an indicator right now that at least as far as our cores go, we're underutilizing this box. Like nothing's happening here. Moving on, we'll go through and we'll look at the actual memory utilization, and memory utilization by process. So yet again, if we take a look up here, we can see that we have loads and loads of free memory there. It's almost a flat line all week. Almost nothing happens. So to me, that indicates that we're not really utilizing the cores or the memory we have here. The last major thing that I think we should really look into to understand this is let's just go and look at the concurrent users. So we know that we're not really using a lot of CPU, we're not using a lot of memory, so how many users actually hit this box? I mean, if it's not that much, why would we have a 3-node cluster here? And so jumping in here, we can actually see that we are averaging, about 4 users a day on this logging in. So we have a 3-node cluster that's using like 30 cores, and we have about 4 users per day. Active sessions are under 2 an hour. So in my opinion, looking at all of this, using this historical data, we're able to go through and see that these spikes show that we're not really utilizing the server. We are perfectly capable of dropping this to a single node box and just having all the users hit that. Because you know what? If it doesn't spike above 10%, if we're not actually pushing the resources that we're allocating to it, then it's a good indication that we're just not using it right. On the other side of this, though, if we were to go through and we were to see an example where we were always sitting in the 90% threshold, then maybe you have to say, my Tableau server instance could be too small for how many users I have. Maybe there's too many logins, maybe there's too many loads, maybe it's just not scaled properly, maybe we didn't set up our processes the way it should be set up. And so at that point, you can go through and you can start looking at architecture. But overall, I just hope this kind of gives you a brief insight into what the actual historical data can do for scaling Tableau server. All right, so with that, let's go through and we'll jump back in. And the next subject that I want to talk about is just how do we go through and apply this? How do we go through and apply what we learned here to other tools? Because I chose to talk about Tableau because it's something that we were a part of when we wrote, and it's one of the original Tableau tools, or one of the things that we wrote in Tableau. But we have a firm understanding that everyone has their own way of doing things, and everyone has their own tools. So let's just step into other tools that can perform the same kind of analysis. And so I chose probably my 3 top favorites, so SolarWinds, Nagios, and Zabbix. Now the pros of all of these are that they tend to be supported. That's the main thing. Tableau, because it's open source, isn't really supported. I mean, we're definitely happy to go and jump on and talk to you guys and answer questions and try to fix whatever bugs we can fix. But overall, because it's community owned, it's not really supported. Next is they're very customizable. I mean, you're paying a company for a full-fledged product for the most part. And so generally, they give you the ability to customize. So you can go through and you can monitor not just Tableau server, but any other server that you have. The other bit is they're flexible. By going through and allowing this customization, they're extremely flexible. Now, the cons of all this is that they generally need to be really configured, like heavily changed in order to work with Tableau server. Most of these, I think SolarWinds, for instance, is the only one that I know for sure can go through and pull JMX, but the actual pollers have to be written yourself. The data also isn't Tableau friendly for the most part. It's generally hard to get to the backend data sources on all these, and when you do pull it in Tableau, most of the time it's not very Tableau friendly, and so it's kind of hard to go through and explore your data that way. The last con is there's just a varying mix of whether or not you can hit JMX. The big thing that Tableau has that a lot doesn't is it's able to go through and look at the Tableau server JMX counters, and that's kind of the secret sauce to Tableau right now. Now, if we have these tools, to actually go through and apply these concepts is pretty easy. I mean, we do the same thing. We record our statistical data. We go through and we run these while reproing issues. we try to, as much as possible, consume it in Tableau Desktop because that way we can go through and we can ask our questions and we can take a look and we can really read into this. So really in the end, despite whatever tool you guys want to use, all of these concepts can be applied, all of these can be run. So it's up to you guys for how you all want to go through and monitor your servers. So with that, I hope you guys got a good sense of how at Tableau we go through and we actually monitor our servers, how we go through and troubleshoot and look into things. From the very highest end, the admin views, to the lowest end where we're taking Tabmon and looking into the logs. I hope this is a little bit of a clear 10,000-foot view into what we do when we monitor our servers. So if you guys have any questions, we'd be happy to answer. Yeah, of course.
So maybe this is the elephant in the room, but so Tableau has some great, this is, Tabmon, this works for,
Yeah.
these are all open source, and is there any future of getting these integrated into the full Tableau stack where they're fully supported and things like that instead of having to go through?
So that's, oh, okay, go ahead, Ramesh.
So longer term, the vision that we want to move towards is a much more combined monitoring platform, maybe, if you want to call it. Because if you look at it, there's multiple things that come in as input. You have your hardware performance contours, which is what kind of Tabmon comes in that angle from, and some of the application level performance contours, which again Tabmon brings in. There's a lot of historical information in Postgres and auditing kind of information there. There's a bunch of information on log files, and today they're all kind of disparate sources, and we definitely want to combine them into a much more cohesive story, such that you can actually say, hey, when this viz was actually loading slow, what was the CPU like? And be able to correlate those things. And so we definitely want to move in that direction.
Yeah, and so we've already implemented some of this a little bit. So for instance, like just the performance monitoring, we introduced SRM within our processes. So that's the Server Resource Manager. So it's actually able to go through and periodically pull the actual resource usage from that node in that process and go and write that out. If you're able to go through and visualize logs, then you can actually go through and you can graph that and you can start to see it. And so it looks very close to. The other side of this is that we've had a lot of different tools or a lot of different features integrated to Tableau by first starting to release open source projects. So data-driven alerting, that actually started out as a Python script that was released on GitHub, and it's one of those things that we're looking and really working on integrating. So if this is something that people are more into and they want to work with and it becomes really popular, then I mean, it becomes more and more likely that we're going to go through and start integrating at some point.
Yes.
I'll start with you, and then I got you next. All right.
Could you talk some of the best practices for log rotations and cleaning up of those directions and stuff?
Sure.
Yes. Repeat the question.
Okay, sorry. So we're going to talk about log rotation and doing cleanups, and when we should actually go through and do our cleanups, how often we do this. This is a hard question to answer because there's no really best answer per se because everyone's different and every environment's different. If we're kind of running low on disk, for instance, and there's not a lot that we can log out and keep logged out, I recommend going through and purging it more often. But with purging, it is nice to go through and keep a cycle of active logs. So say you go through and you're about to purge, go and take a zip log and throw it in a directory, maybe a remote drive somewhere. And then you can actually go through and, every couple of weeks, so you'll go through and you'll have 14 of these. You just start purging out the oldest data so you can kind of get yourself a rolling view of how your server was performing. So it really comes down to how much space you have and how willing you are to just let it sit. If you do that, sometimes you can actually run out of CPU. So I do recommend at least purging. I probably do like once or twice a month. Just whenever you see something, disk space getting a little bit low or they're getting a bit too hectic to go and look through, that's when I generally go and do it. But overall, I think that keeping that data around at least for a little bit can be really beneficial. So if you ever have an issue and you talk to support, for instance, you can say, look, this is the old log set and you can see how it's working, and this is the new log set. And now this is how it's working. And it's really nice and easy to compare that way. All right, so I think I got you next.
If you uninstall Tableau,
Okay, yeah, so the question is, if you uninstall Tabmon, does it uninstall Postgres with it? I get this a lot. No, it does not. The reason it doesn't is because we view this as a historical tool and historical monitoring, and we want Postgres to be there so that you can go through and you can catalog that data and you can keep that data around. So we don't actually remove it. In order to do it, it's just SC stop and SC delete, so stop service and delete the service, and then after that you can go through and you can just wipe those folders because we don't actually install it from the Windows perspective. We just go through and we move all of the folders needed to use Postgres to the actual hard drive, and then we initialize it and we start it as a service. So we don't, but with the new release, if you're worried about things like space, we just created a purge feature, which means you can set an interval, and it will pull and pull and pull, and after it hits your interval, it'll start deleting data that's older than however long your interval is. Mhm. Yeah, we'll start with you and then you.
Curating logs in JSON format, do you foresee releasing analytics to look at the JSONs and bring out common problems?
Okay, so the question is, since we have logs in JSON, are we going to go through and are we going to release the ability to actually just look at those JSON files? And the answer is yes, actually. I believe 10.1 just released a JSON connector. So you can go and you can start digging into that. The one thing I got to say, though, is a lot of the JSON that we see, actually the values of it will have embedded JSON. So you'll see embedded lists and embedded libraries. So the issue that you're going to have with the actual JSON reader is it's going to go and see that value there. And it's actually just going to read that as like a text blob or a string. So you may not actually be able to dig into things like that. So if you're looking at a parallel query, for instance, you're not going to be able to go through and dynamically look at every single query you have in there. It's just going to be a text blob. So it's a little bit difficult there. The one thing, and this is kind of a pitch, so sorry about this. We wrote this tool called LogShark. We released it last week. It goes through and programmatically parses our logs, stores them in Mongo, and runs plugins as an ETL solution on them so we can build data sources and visualize them. So if you want to go through and look at logs that way too, we kind of released an open source tool that could, I think, get us there. It's called LogShark. Yeah. There's actually, I have a session on it at 3:15. Yes. Oh, yeah. Actually, to talk about that, I do have related sessions. Most of it is about adminning. I didn't really want to go through and advertise my own product. I feel bad about that, so sorry, guys. All right, cool. Next question, we had you in the back.
So if there is an issue with the particular workload,
Mm-hmm.
as an admin, if you want to check it on the server, the SQL reminder, what is calling, what's the easiest way? Because we might have thousands of workloads. So it's always a common for us to like figure out who's the user, what SQL behind the workload.
So the question is, if you have one workbook that's not always performant and you want to go and you want to look at the SQL behind the workbook, right? How would we do that? So the way I would do that is I'd go back to what Ramesh was talking about and using the server admin views. And you can use that to actually go through and find the requests for that workbook. You can filter down. Once you can see the request, you can actually look at the request body. And within that string itself is the actual request ID. If you go and get the request ID, you can crack open the VizQL server C++ logs and search or grep through there for anything with that request ID. And as long as it has the request ID, it'll show you the full active session there and what's going on. Using that, you can use things like endQuery because of all of our endQuery statements and our QP endQuery statements will go through and have elapsed time on it. So you're actually able to go through and look at the performance of all the queries that are sent to SQL that way. Did that get your question? I don't know if we have an article because that's kind of a, I don't know how to describe it. It's something that I do every day.
We can add one if it's not there.
Yeah.
But this is essentially like what he described as correlating an admin view with information in the logs.
Yeah, and it's
I mean, like if I look at the background, or like it says like you put more than 2 hours in the page, so it should be a, if you drill into that particular workbook name on the background or not,
Mhm.
it should able to take us to that particular SQL or whatever behind that. So it internally reduces a lot of work for us to go back to the publisher and talk to them, there's a lot of, it doesn't provide better user experience. Let's say, why don't you guys figure it out on the server rather than coming back to publisher? So
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you. Because I do use your admin view a lot, but it's not, does not have enough knowledge to take into more. Maybe good things since already there.
Yeah. So that's part of the reason that we talked a lot about the logs as well, because the logs really do give the insight to it. The issue is they're really verbose, and it takes a lot of background knowledge, and it takes some time to get used to it and really learn it. And so it can, I know, it can be really tough, and it's one of those things, it's when you first start doing it, it's almost overwhelming, but the more you start to see how all the pieces are connected and how the architecture actually works, it becomes faster and faster, and then you can start utilizing tools like the admin views or LogShark or what have you to go through and start visualizing and really looking at what's going on in the background. So it's, right now, there's not an easy answer for it, but it's doable.
No, I think the server view is an easy answer. But what I'm saying is, I mean, immediately after this class, I will think, okay, I'm going to install the Tableau. But and then I need to start from scratch the skill set. Instead of I have using the server view, I will cover using it. So, but I just do not go a few steps further. For example, the first slideshow you mentioned about, I mean, I really get lost already. I said, I don't remember I saw that. There would be something I missed, I did not get into that. So there's something also I'm interested in. I mean, I'm sure the log is really useful, but kind of the starting point, the server view, there's the money.
Yeah, it's not very user-friendly. The logs aren't necessarily user-friendly.
And there is more work to be done here to kind of make this whole thing, make the correlation of events across multiple sources more cohesive and easier to troubleshoot. So yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have you in the back.
Yeah, I'm finding the Postgres tables get too big, and the admin view keeps spinning because it takes time to render.
Yes.
Is there any way to auto purge through Tableau all the old points?
Yeah, so the question was, you find that that Postgres gets too big sometimes, and the admin views actually spin, and it gets hard to go through and use them, correct? I believe that a tab admin cleanup will actually go through and dispose of old data. So if you do a tab admin cleanup -r, that will go through and that will purge the HTTP table, and that means that it will purge all those requests out of there, so you're able to go through and strip down data. So if you periodically do that, you should actually be able to decrease the amount of data that is used for that view.
I'm in the Postgres for Tableau.
Oh, for Tabmon. So if you're using version 1 of Tabmon, there's no real easy way to do that. I might go through and recommend writing a script that truncates or deletes data from it every once in a while. If you're using 1.1, there's a new feature in it that purges after a set interval. So you can set your interval to maybe 10 days, 15 days, a month. I think it's naturally set at 30 days. And every single time you pull, it will go through and it will query to see whether there's data within that database that's older than that interval. And if there is, it'll go through and it will purge that. So if there's any other questions or no other questions, I think that's it. We do have a survey, so if you guys would like to go through and rate us on that, that'd be cool. If not, we'll have a great TC, guys.